The rain hit the cobblestones hard when the carriage wheels stopped right in front of Alina Whitmore, splashing dirty water across her only clean apron. She did not even look up. She had learned long ago that looking up only invited more trouble. A voice called out from the carriage window, sharp and mocking, telling her to move faster next time or she would lose her place at the house entirely. Alina gathered the wet linens from the ground, her fingers numb from the cold, and said nothing. This was her life. 6 days a week she washed and folded clothes for families who barely remembered her name, and on the 7th day she prayed that nothing worse would happen. She was 26 years old, unmarried, without parents, and without a single person in the town of Ashwell who called her a friend. They called her many things: a nobody, a charity case, the girl with no history. Nobody ever asked where she came from because everyone assumed the answer did not matter. But Alina carried one secret that no one in Ashwell knew about. Around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, hung a small gold locket. It had been given to her by the woman who raised her, a kind but distant caretaker named Mrs. Doyle, who passed away when Alina was just 16. Mrs. Doyle had told her only one thing about the locket before she died. She said it belonged to Alina's mother, and that one day someone would come looking for it. Alina had waited 10 years for that day. She had almost stopped waiting. The town of Ashwell was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Alina. She had arrived as an infant, left at the door of the local church with nothing but a blanket and that locket sewn carefully into the lining of her clothes. The priest who found her gave her to Mrs. Doyle, an elderly widow with a kind heart and very little money. Mrs. Doyle worked as a laundress, and when she grew too old to carry the heavy baskets herself, young Alina took over the work. It became her whole world. Wash, fold, deliver, repeat. The wealthy families of Ashwell treated her the way people treat furniture, useful but invisible. She delivered clean shirts to the Hartley family every Tuesday, and Mrs. Hartley never once looked her in the eye. She pressed dresses for the Coltrane sisters, who laughed about her patched shoes as if she could not hear them standing right there. Even the children in town had learned to whisper the word nobody whenever she passed, as though it was simply a fact of nature, like the color of the sky. On this particular afternoon, after the carriage splashed her apron and rode away without apology, Alina walked the long road back to her small cottage at the edge of town. The cottage had once belonged to Mrs. Doyle, and Alina had done her best to keep it standing, patching the roof herself when the winter storms tore through the thatch. Inside, she hung the wet linens near the fire to dry and finally allowed herself to sit for a moment. She reached beneath her collar and pulled out the locket, turning it over in her fingers the way she did almost every evening. It never opened. She had tried for years to find the tiny clasp, but the metal had fused shut with age, or perhaps it was locked by some mechanism she did not understand. All she knew was that it was warm from her skin, and it was the only piece of her past she had ever held. That night, as she prepared a thin soup from the last of her vegetables, there was a knock at her door. Visitors never came to her cottage. Not once in 10 years had anyone chosen to walk the muddy path to her home simply to see her. Alina opened the door carefully, expecting perhaps a neighbor asking for laundry to be done on short notice. Instead, she found a well-dressed stranger standing under an umbrella, his boots far too clean for the road he had just walked. He introduced himself as Mr. Barlow, a solicitor from London, and he asked, in a voice far too formal for her small doorway, whether he was speaking with a woman named Alina Whitmore. Alina's heart began to beat faster, though she could not explain why. She confirmed her name, and Mr. Barlow's expression changed, something between relief and disbelief crossing his face. He told her that he had been searching for her for almost 3 months, following a trail that led from London to 3 different counties before finally arriving in Ashwell. He said he carried news of great importance, news that could not be discussed properly on a doorstep in the rain. He asked if he might come inside. Alina stepped aside, her mind racing through every possibility. Perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps he was looking for a different Alina Whitmore, a woman of some standing, not a laundress with patched shoes and a cottage held together by her own hands. She poured him a cup of the weak tea she kept for special occasions, though her hands trembled slightly as she did it. Mr. Barlow sat at her small wooden table, opened his leather case, and pulled out a thick folded document sealed with red wax. He explained that a nobleman named Lord Whitmore Ashford had passed away 2 months earlier, leaving behind no children of his own. According to his will, his entire estate, including his fortune, his properties, and his shares in a trading company that operated ships across 3 continents, was to be inherited by a woman matching a very specific description. A woman born in a particular year, given away as an infant, and identifiable by a single item, a gold locket engraved with a pattern of intertwined leaves. Alina's breath caught in her throat. Without a word, she reached beneath her collar and pulled the locket free, setting it gently on the table between them. Mr. Barlow leaned forward, examined the engraving closely, and then sat back in his chair with the look of a man who had finally solved a puzzle that had troubled him for months. He confirmed, in a quiet and steady voice, that this was the locket described in the will. Alina Whitmore, the woman everyone in Ashwell called a nobody, was the sole heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country. For a long moment Alina could not speak. She stared at the locket, then at Mr. Barlow, then at the worn walls of the cottage she had spent her entire life trying to keep from collapsing. It felt impossible, the kind of story told to children to give them hope, never meant to actually happen to someone like her. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, if he was certain there was no mistake. Mr. Barlow assured her there was none. He had cross-checked the details 3 times before beginning his search, and every detail matched. He explained that she would need to travel to London within the month to appear before the court and the family solicitors for the official reading of the will. There would be relatives present, distant cousins of the late Lord Ashford, who had already been informed that an heir had been found. Mr. Barlow warned her, gently but honestly, that some of these relatives had expected to inherit the fortune themselves, and they would not be pleased to learn that a laundress from Ashwell now stood between them and that inheritance. Alina barely slept that night. She lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of her cottage, turning the locket over and over in her hands, trying to imagine a life beyond washing linens and delivering pressed shirts to people who never said thank you. She thought of Mrs. Doyle, and how she had always insisted that someone would come looking for the locket one day. She wished, more than anything, that the old woman could have lived to see this moment. Word spread through Ashwell faster than Alina could have imagined. By the time she walked to the market 3 days later, the whispers had already changed shape. No longer was she simply the nobody with no family. Now she was the nobody who claimed to be an heiress, and the town seemed to enjoy that version of the story even more, because it gave them something new to laugh about. Mrs. Hartley stopped her outside the bakery and asked, with a thin smile, whether Alina had finally lost her mind from too many years of breathing in soap fumes. The Coltrane sisters giggled behind their gloved hands as she passed, loud enough for her to hear every word. Alina did not argue with any of them. She simply held the locket a little tighter beneath her collar and kept walking. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she had learned that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind. Better to let the truth speak for itself, whenever it finally arrived. Mr. Barlow returned a week later with train tickets and a modest sum of money to cover her travel and a proper set of clothes for the journey. He explained that appearing before the court in her usual attire might invite unnecessary judgment, and Alina, practical as always, agreed without complaint. She sold what little furniture she could part with, gave her remaining laundry customers notice, and packed the few belongings she owned into a single worn trunk that had once belonged to Mrs. Doyle. On the morning she left Ashwell, no one came to see her off. No friends waved from the road, no neighbors wished her luck. She walked to the train station alone, the locket resting against her chest, carrying with her 10 years of quiet humiliation and a single fragile hope that her life was finally about to change. As the train pulled away from the small station, Alina pressed her hand against the cold window and watched the only home she had ever known shrink into the distance. She did not cry. She had cried enough over the years for things far smaller than this. Instead, she sat up straight, folded her hands in her lap, and stared forward toward London, toward a fortune she never expected, and toward a truth about her own past that she was only beginning to understand. She had no way of knowing, as the train rushed toward the city, that a duke named Nathaniel Ashford was, at that very moment, standing in his study reading a letter about the very same will, and that the name Alina Whitmore had just struck something deep and unexpected in his memory. He set the letter down slowly, walked to a locked drawer in his desk, and pulled out an old portrait wrapped in cloth, one he had not looked at in over 20 years. As he unwrapped it, his hands were not entirely steady. The woman in the portrait had a face he recognized instantly, one he had never been able to forget, no matter how many years had passed. And though he did not yet know it for certain, something told him that the nobody from Ashwell was about to change everything. London greeted Alina with a noise she had never known existed. The station alone held more people than the entire town of Ashwell, and every one of them seemed to be moving with a purpose she could not understand. Mr. Barlow met her at the platform, dressed even more formally than before, and guided her toward a waiting carriage with a calm efficiency that told her this was simply another ordinary day for him, even though it felt like the beginning of an entirely new life for her. The townhouse where she would stay until the reading of the will belonged to the late Lord Ashford's estate, and it was larger than any building Alina had ever entered, let alone lived inside. A housekeeper named Mrs. Pratt showed her to a bedroom with a bed so soft she was afraid to sit on it, and a wardrobe already filled with dresses that had been prepared according to measurements taken from a letter Alina had sent weeks earlier. She ran her fingers over the fine fabric, still half convinced that she would wake up back in her cottage in Ashwell, the whole thing nothing more than an elaborate dream brought on by exhaustion. That evening, Mrs. Pratt helped her dress for the following day's proceedings, adjusting the fit of a deep green gown that made Alina barely recognize her own reflection in the mirror. She had spent her life in patched aprons and worn boots, and now she stood before a full-length glass wearing clothing finer than anything the Coltrane sisters had ever owned. It should have felt wonderful. Instead, it felt strange, almost like wearing someone else's skin. The morning of the will reading arrived with a heavy gray sky, matching the knot of nerves twisting inside Alina's stomach. Mr. Barlow arrived early to escort her personally, explaining once more, gently but firmly, what she should expect. The gathering would include several distant relatives of the late Lord Ashford, all of whom had believed, until recently, that the fortune would eventually pass to one of them. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a duke would be present, a longtime friend and business associate of the late lord, who had insisted on attending despite having no legal claim to the inheritance himself. Alina barely registered the mention of the duke. Her mind was too occupied with the fear of walking into a room full of strangers who already resented her before she had even said a single word. The solicitor's office was grand in a quiet, understated way, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in weak streams of morning light. When Alina entered, escorted by Mr. Barlow, every head in the room turned toward her at once. She felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing pressing against her chest. 3 relatives sat along one side of a long table, an older man with a thick gray mustache who introduced himself only as Cousin Harold, a sharp-faced woman named Margaret Colt who wore an expression of open disdain, and a younger man, likely Margaret's son, who did not bother to hide his impatience. At the head of the table sat a man Alina had not expected. He was tall, composed, with dark hair beginning to gray slightly at the temples, and eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through the borrowed green gown to the laundress underneath. He rose slightly as she entered, a small gesture of respect that none of the others offered, and introduced himself simply as Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Marlow. Alina took her seat at the far end of the table, aware of Margaret Colt's eyes narrowing with every passing second. The solicitor overseeing the reading, an elderly man named Mr. Faring, cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings, unfolding the will with the careful precision of someone who had done this many times before, but understood the weight this particular reading carried. He began by outlining the full extent of Lord Ashford's estate, the manor house in Kent, untouched and fully staffed, waiting for its new owner, a townhouse in London, the very one Alina currently occupied, substantial holdings in a shipping company that operated across 3 continents, along with investments in several smaller ventures that alone amounted to more wealth than Alina could properly imagine. Cousin Harold's mustache twitched with barely contained frustration as the numbers were read aloud, each one a fresh wound to a fortune he had clearly expected to inherit himself. Then came the clause everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Fearing read, in careful and deliberate words, that the entire estate was to pass to a woman, identified only by her birth year, and a gold locket engraved with intertwined leaves. A woman who had been given up as an infant under circumstances the will did not fully explain. He then turned to Alina and asked her, formally, to present the locket for verification before the assembled witnesses. Alina's hands trembled slightly as she reached beneath her collar and pulled the locket free, placing it gently on the table. Mr. Fearing examined it closely, comparing it against a small sketch attached to the will itself, and after a long, silent moment, he nodded and confirmed that the match was exact. The room erupted, though quietly, in the particular way that wealthy people expressed outrage without raising their voices. Margaret Colt stood so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor, declaring that this was clearly some elaborate fraud, that a laundress from a village no one had ever heard of could not possibly be the rightful heir to such an enormous fortune. Cousin Harold muttered something about hiring investigators to expose the scheme, while his son simply stared at Alina with open contempt, as though she had personally stolen something from him. Through all of it, Duke Nathaniel Ashford said nothing. He watched Alina with the same quiet, unreadable intensity he had shown from the moment she entered the room, and when Margaret Colt's protests grew loud enough to draw a warning glance from Mr. Fearing, the Duke finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried an authority that silenced the room instantly. He stated simply that the will had been verified according to the late Lord's explicit instructions, that the locket matched precisely, and that any further dispute would need to be settled through proper legal channels rather than shouted accusations in a solicitor's office. Margaret Colt sat back down, her face pale with anger, but she said nothing more. Alina, still trembling slightly, glanced toward the Duke, uncertain whether his defense had been for her sake or simply his respect for proper procedure. His expression gave nothing away, but for one brief moment, his eyes lingered on the locket resting on the table, and something flickered across his face that Alina could not quite name. It looked almost like recognition. The reading concluded with Mr. Fearing outlining the legal steps required to formally transfer the estate, a process that would take several weeks and require Alina's presence in London throughout. As the relatives filed out of the room, each one shooting her a final glare of resentment, Alina remained seated, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what had just happened to her life in the span of a single hour. Duke Nathaniel approached her before he left, and up close, Alina could see that his composed exterior hid something more complicated underneath. He asked her, quite directly, where exactly she had grown up and whether she knew anything about her birth parents. Alina admitted honestly that she knew almost nothing, only that she had been left at a church in Ashwell as an infant, raised by a kind widow who had passed away years earlier, and that the locket was the only clue she had ever possessed about her origins. The Duke listened carefully, his jaw tightening slightly at certain details, though he offered no explanation for his reaction. He simply told her before taking his leave that he hoped she would be careful in the coming weeks, as sudden wealth had a way of attracting people with less than honest intentions. It was, Alina thought, an oddly personal warning from a man she had just met, but something in his tone told her he meant it sincerely. That night back in the grand townhouse that now technically belonged to her, Alina sat by the window holding the locket in her palm, thinking about the Duke's strange reaction and the flash of recognition she had seen cross his face. She did not know what it meant, but she felt certain of one thing. Her arrival in London had stirred something far deeper than a simple inheritance dispute, and the true story of who she really was had only just begun to surface. Meanwhile, in a townhouse not far from where Alina sat, Margaret Colt paced furiously across her drawing room, her son watching nervously from a chair near the fireplace. She declared, her voice sharp with fury, that she would not allow some nameless laundress to walk away with a fortune that should rightfully belong to family, real family people who had earned their place through blood, rather than a piece of jewelry with a convenient engraving. She sent for Cousin Harold that very evening, and by the time the candles burned low, the two of them had already begun sketching out a plan to challenge the will through every means available to them, legal or otherwise. Alina Whitmore had inherited a fortune, but she had also, without knowing it, inherited a set of enemies who had no intention of accepting defeat quietly. Within days, the story of the laundress who inherited a fortune had spread through London society like fire through dry grass. Alina could not walk through a single room without noticing whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered, or catching sideways glances filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The newspapers, always hungry for scandal among the wealthy, picked up the story quickly, printing exaggerated accounts that painted her as either a clever schemer or a pitiful fraud, never once considering that she might simply be exactly what she claimed, an ordinary woman caught in an extraordinary turn of fate. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, tried her best to shield Alina from the worst of the gossip, but it proved impossible to keep the world entirely at bay. Invitations began arriving at the townhouse, some out of genuine curiosity, others clearly designed to give society's most vicious tongues a chance to examine the new heiress up close and pick her apart at their leisure. Alina wanted nothing more than to refuse every single one, to stay locked away in the safety of her borrowed rooms until the legal process concluded, and she could quietly disappear somewhere far from prying eyes. But Mr. Barlow advised against hiding. He explained, with the patience of a man who understood how these things worked, that avoiding society entirely would only fuel further suspicion. If she wished to secure her inheritance without endless legal battles, she needed to be seen, and more importantly, she needed to be seen with confidence. The first event she agreed to attend was a modest gathering hosted by a family with only distant ties to the late Lord Ashford, chosen carefully by Mr. Barlow, because it carried less risk than the larger, more predatory social circles. Alina dressed carefully that evening, still uncomfortable in the fine fabrics that now filled her wardrobe, and arrived at the townhouse with her heart pounding steadily against her ribs. The moment she stepped into the drawing room, conversation dimmed to a low murmur, and dozens of eyes turned toward her with an intensity that made her want to retreat back through the door. She held her chin level, remembering the years of quiet dignity she had maintained through every humiliation in Ashwell, and reminded herself that she had survived far worse than a room full of curious strangers. It did not take long for the whispers to grow bold enough to reach her directly. A woman near the refreshment table remarked, just loud enough for Alina to hear, that it was remarkable what a fine dress could do to disguise common blood. Another guest, a thin-faced gentleman with an amused smirk, asked her directly, with false politeness, whether she had learned which fork to use for the fish course, or whether her years scrubbing linens had left her too callous to hold silverware properly. Alina felt her face grow warm with humiliation, but she forced herself to answer calmly, stating simply that she had, in fact, managed the fork perfectly well, and that scrubbing linens had taught her more about patience and hard work than most people in that room would ever learn from a lifetime of comfort. Her sharp reply drew a few surprised laughs from nearby guests, and for a moment the tide of the room shifted slightly in her favor. But the reprieve did not last long. Margaret Colt arrived not long after, uninvited but unwilling to miss an opportunity to publicly undermine the woman she considered an impostor. She moved through the room with practiced grace, dropping comments here and there designed to plant doubt about Alina's legitimacy, suggesting to anyone who would listen that the locket could easily have been stolen or purchased or forged entirely by someone clever enough to research the will's requirements in advance. Alina stood near the edge of the room, increasingly isolated as small clusters of guests drifted away from her, unwilling to be seen too closely associated with someone whose position in society remained so publicly contested. It was in this moment, as she felt the walls of the evening closing in around her, that Duke Nathaniel Ashford entered the gathering. His arrival shifted the entire atmosphere of the room instantly. Conversations paused out of respect, and several guests moved quickly to greet him, eager for even a moment of his attention. He accepted their greetings with brief, polite nods, but his gaze moved past them almost immediately, searching the room until it landed on Alina standing alone near the window. He crossed the room directly, ignoring the surprised murmurs that followed his path, and greeted her with a formal bow that felt, to Alina, far more genuine than anything she had received from the rest of the guests combined. He asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear, whether she was enjoying the evening, and before she could answer, Margaret Colt inserted herself into the conversation, her tone dripping with false sweetness as she suggested that perhaps the Duke ought to be cautious about associating too closely with someone whose claim to the inheritance remained, in her words, deeply questionable. The Duke turned toward Margaret Colt with an expression that, while still perfectly composed, carried an unmistakable edge of warning. He stated plainly, for the benefit of everyone within earshot, that the will had been verified through proper legal process, that the locket matched the description provided by the late Lord himself, and that any further suggestion of fraud without evidence would be treated as slander, a serious accusation he would personally ensure was addressed through the courts if necessary. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Margaret Colt's face flushed with anger, but she had no response prepared for such a direct and public rebuke from a man of the Duke's standing. She excused herself quickly, retreating toward the far side of the room, and the whispers that followed her departure carried a very different tone than the ones that had circled Alina only moments before. Alina turned to the Duke, both grateful and confused by his willingness to defend her so publicly. She asked him quietly why he had chosen to intervene, given that he had no personal stake in the matter and barely knew her at all. The Duke considered his answer for a long moment before responding, his voice lower now, meant only for her. He said that he had known the late Lord Ashford for many years, that the man had been meticulous and careful in every aspect of his life, and that he would never have written such specific and unusual terms into his will without absolute certainty about the person he intended to inherit his fortune. He believed, he said, that there was more to her story than even she herself understood, and he intended to see the truth uncovered properly, rather than allow greedy relatives to bury it beneath false accusations. Alina studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of the strange reaction she had witnessed during the will reading, that brief flicker of recognition when he had looked at her locket. She asked him directly whether he knew something about her past that she did not. For a moment, something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, before he answered carefully that he could not yet say anything with certainty, but that he intended to look into a few matters, and that he would share whatever he discovered once he was sure of the facts. It was not the answer Alina had hoped for, but it was enough to plant a seed of hope that had not existed in her heart for 10 long years. Perhaps, after everything, she was not simply a nobody who had stumbled into unexpected wealth. Perhaps there was a real story behind her existence, one that connected her not just to a fortune, but to people, to a family, to a history she had never been allowed to know. Over the following days, Alina noticed a subtle shift in how she was treated in certain circles. Word of the Duke's public defense had spread quickly, and while Margaret Colt and her allies continued their quiet campaign of doubt, a number of society figures who had previously kept their distance now offered cautious, polite greetings whenever their paths crossed. Wealth alone had not earned Alina respect, but the Duke's endorsement carried weight that no amount of money could purchase on its own. Meanwhile, away from the ballrooms and drawing rooms, Duke Nathaniel Ashford spent his evenings in the quiet privacy of his study, surrounded by old letters and documents he had not touched in over 2 decades. He pulled the wrapped portrait from his locked drawer once more, staring at the painted face of a woman he had known briefly in his youth, a woman whose disappearance had never been fully explained to him, and whose memory had haunted the edges of his conscience for far longer than he cared to admit. He compared her features carefully against what he remembered of Alina's face from the will reading, tracing the similarities in the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, details too specific to be mere coincidence. He also began quietly making inquiries through trusted contacts, discreet men who specialized in tracing family histories and uncovering records that had been deliberately buried. He asked them to search for any information connected to a woman who had vanished from London society roughly 27 years earlier, a woman whose sudden disappearance had once been the subject of hushed rumors before fading entirely from public memory. Alina, unaware of the full extent of the Duke's private investigation, continued navigating the delicate process of securing her inheritance, attending meetings with solicitors, reviewing documents she barely understood, and enduring the continued hostility of Margaret Colt and Cousin Harold, who had hired their own lawyer to challenge the will's validity on technical grounds. Each day brought new challenges, new whispers, and new small victories, but through it all, Alina found herself thinking more and more about the strange, quiet Duke who seemed determined to uncover a truth that even she did not yet know existed. Something told her that the answers he was searching for would change her life just as profoundly as the inheritance itself, and she was not entirely certain whether she was ready for what those answers might reveal. 3 weeks into her new life in London, Alina received a formal invitation to dine privately with Duke Nathaniel Ashford at his family estate, just outside the city. The invitation came through Mr. Barlow, who assured her that such a meeting was entirely appropriate given the Duke's close friendship with the late Lord Ashford, and that he likely wished to discuss matters relevant to her inheritance in a setting away from the prying eyes of London society. Alina accepted, though a part of her suspected the true purpose of the invitation had little to do with legal matters at all. The Ashford estate stood far grander than anything Alina had encountered even in London, a sprawling stone manor surrounded by carefully tended gardens that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. A servant guided her through wide hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, each one watching her pass with painted eyes that seemed to question her right to walk such halls at all. She was shown into a private dining room where the Duke waited alone, having dismissed the usual formal staff in favor of a quiet, unattended evening. He greeted her warmly, more relaxed than she had seen him during any of their previous encounters in crowded ballrooms. Over a simple but elegant meal, he asked her gently about her childhood in Ashwell, listening with genuine attention as she described the years spent under Mrs. Doyle's care, the long hours of washing linens, and the constant sting of being treated as invisible by the people around her. He asked careful questions about Mrs. Doyle herself, about how she had come to care for Alina, and whether she had ever mentioned anything specific about where the infant Alina had come from. Alina explained everything she knew, which admittedly was very little. Mrs. Doyle had told her only that a priest had brought the infant to her, having found her abandoned at the church steps with the locket sewn into her blanket, and that the priest himself had passed away many years before Alina was old enough to ask him any questions directly. It was, Alina admitted, an unsatisfying answer, one that left more questions than it resolved, and she had long ago given up hope of ever learning more. The Duke listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each detail she shared. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before finally rising from his chair and crossing the room to a locked cabinet near the fireplace. He retrieved a small wrapped bundle and returned to the table, setting it down carefully before her. He explained that what he was about to show her had remained hidden for over 20 years, and that he had debated for days whether revealing it was the right decision, but that he could no longer, in good conscience, keep it from her. Alina unwrapped the cloth with trembling hands, revealing a small painted portrait of a young woman with soft brown hair and striking green eyes, dressed in the fashion of decades past. The resemblance struck her immediately, so strong it felt as though she were looking into a mirror that had somehow traveled backward through time. She looked up at the Duke, questions forming faster than she could voice them. He explained, his voice carrying an unfamiliar weight of emotion, that the woman in the portrait was named Charlotte Ellery, a young woman he had known personally many years earlier, before he had inherited his title and responsibilities. Charlotte had been the daughter of a respected but not particularly wealthy family, and she had been, for a brief and complicated period of his youth, someone he cared for deeply. Their families, however, had strongly disapproved of the match, believing Charlotte's lower social standing unsuitable for a future duke, and pressure from all sides had eventually forced the relationship apart. Alina listened, captivated, as the duke continued his account. He explained that shortly after their forced separation, Charlotte had disappeared from London entirely, with no explanation offered to anyone, not even to close friends who had tried desperately to locate her. Rumors circulated for a time, most of them cruel and speculative, but eventually the scandal faded from memory, and Charlotte Ellery became little more than a name occasionally mentioned in old society gossip. The Duke admitted that he had spent years wondering what had truly happened to her, though duty and time had eventually pushed the questions to the back of his mind, until the moment he saw Alina's face at the will reading and felt as though he were looking at a ghost from his own past. Alina's hands trembled as she held the portrait, staring into eyes that mirrored her own so precisely it could not possibly be coincidence. She asked, her voice barely steady, whether the Duke believed Charlotte Ellery could have been her mother. He answered carefully, explaining that he could not be entirely certain without further evidence, but that the timing aligned closely with Alina's estimated birth year, and the resemblance was, in his own words, undeniable. He then revealed something further, something he admitted he had only recently uncovered through his discreet inquiries. Charlotte Ellery had, in fact, been distantly connected to the late Lord Ashford's family through a complicated web of marriages and inheritances that had unraveled generations earlier. It was entirely possible, he explained, that Lord Ashford had somehow learned of Charlotte's fate, perhaps even assisted her during a difficult period, and had structured his will specifically to ensure that her child, if one existed, would eventually receive an inheritance that had, in some distant sense, always belonged to that branch of the family. Alina sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the sheer weight of what she was being told. For 10 years, she had been nothing more than a nameless girl left on a church doorstep, and now, within the span of a single evening, she was being told that she might be the daughter of a woman connected to 2 of the wealthiest families in the country, a woman whose forced disappearance had been shrouded in scandal and secrecy for nearly 3 decades. She asked the obvious, painful question. If the Duke had once cared so deeply for Charlotte, why had he never searched for her more thoroughly? Why had he allowed her to simply vanish without ever learning the truth of what became of her? His expression grew heavy with old regret as he admitted that he had been young, pressured relentlessly by his family, and ultimately too cowardly to defy the expectations placed upon him. He had let duty win over love, and he had spent every year since quietly wondering what his life might have looked like had he chosen differently. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them dared to voice directly. Alina studied the man before her, no longer simply the composed and distant Duke who had defended her honor at a society gathering, but a man carrying deep, unresolved guilt over choices made decades earlier, choices that had somehow, through fate or coincidence or something else entirely, led directly to her sitting across from him at this very table. Before either of them could speak further, a servant interrupted with urgent news. A letter had arrived, delivered by private courier, addressed specifically to the Duke, and marked with a seal Alina did not recognize. He excused himself briefly, and when he returned, his expression had shifted from quiet reflection to sharp concern. He explained that the letter came from a man named Lord Edmund Grayson, a distant relative of Charlotte Ellery's family, someone the Duke had not heard from in many years, and someone whose sudden interest in the matter could not possibly be a coincidence. The letter, he explained, made vague but pointed references to Alina's inheritance, suggesting that certain details about her birth and parentage were far more complicated and dangerous than she currently understood, and warning the Duke, in barely veiled language, to abandon his inquiries before uncomfortable truths were forced into the open. Alina felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the dining room. Whatever secrets surrounded her mother's disappearance, it seemed she was not the only one determined to keep them buried. The Duke folded the letter carefully and set it aside, his jaw tightening with a resolve Alina had not seen from him before. He told her plainly that he had no intention of backing away from the truth simply because someone wished to intimidate him into silence. If Lord Grayson had something to hide, the Duke intended to uncover exactly what it was, no matter how long it took or how many powerful people it might upset along the way. Alina left the estate that evening with far more questions than answers, but for the first time since her arrival in London, she felt something shift within her, a quiet, steady resolve replacing the confusion and fear that had followed her since Mr. Barlow first knocked on her cottage door. She was no longer simply a nobody who had inherited an unexpected fortune. She was, quite possibly, the daughter of a woman erased from history by families too proud to accept love over status, and she intended to learn the full truth, whatever the cost, and whoever tried to stop her along the way. Sleep did not come easily to Alina that night. She lay awake in the grand bedroom of the London townhouse, the portrait of Charlotte Ellery propped against the lamp on her nightstand, studying every detail of the painted face as though it might suddenly speak and answer the questions burning inside her. She thought about the Duke's confession, about the guilt etched into his features when he admitted he had let duty overrule his own heart all those years ago, and she wondered how different her life might have been had things gone differently for two young people she had never even known existed until a few hours earlier. The following morning, Mr. Barlow arrived at the townhouse earlier than usual, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. He informed Alina that word of Lord Grayson's letter had somehow already reached certain circles in London society, and that fresh rumors were spreading, this time suggesting that her claim to the inheritance was connected to some old scandal the wealthy families of the city had spent decades trying to bury. Alina felt her stomach tighten. It seemed the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was going to surface whether she was ready for it or not. She sent word to the Duke, requesting to meet again as soon as possible, and he responded within hours, inviting her back to the estate that very afternoon. This time, when she arrived, she found him in his study rather than the dining room, surrounded by stacks of old letters, ledgers, and documents that his private investigators had gathered over the past several days. He looked as though he had not slept much either. He explained that his inquiries had finally uncovered a clearer picture of what happened to Charlotte Ellery nearly 27 years earlier, though the story was far more troubling than he had anticipated. According to records his investigators had managed to trace, Charlotte had been quietly sent away from London shortly after her relationship with the young Nathaniel Ashford ended, not simply out of family shame, but because she had been discovered to be with child. Her own family, terrified of the scandal such news would bring, had arranged for her to be relocated to a distant relative's household under the pretense of an extended visit, while privately making plans to have the child given up quietly once it was born, with no public record connecting the infant to either family. Alina listened, her chest tight with a strange mixture of grief and anger on behalf of a mother she had never known. The Duke continued, explaining that Charlotte's own cousin at the time had been none other than a young relative of the Grayson family, the same family whose current patriarch, Lord Edmund Grayson, had sent the threatening letter warning the Duke to abandon his investigation. It appeared that the Grayson family had played a direct role in arranging Charlotte's exile and the subsequent concealment of her child's birth, likely to protect their own reputation from association with such a scandal. What the Duke had not yet uncovered, however, was what became of Charlotte herself after the birth. Records seemed to simply stop, as though she had vanished from existence entirely once her usefulness to the family's careful cover-up had ended. Alina asked, her voice trembling slightly, whether the Duke believed Charlotte was still alive somewhere, perhaps still unaware that her daughter had grown up only a few counties away, forgotten and unclaimed. The Duke admitted honestly that he did not know, but he intended to keep searching until he had a definitive answer, one way or another. It was during this conversation that a name surfaced that would prove critical to everything that followed. Among the documents the Duke's investigators had gathered was a faded letter written by Charlotte herself, addressed to a trusted friend, shortly before she disappeared from public record entirely. In the letter, Charlotte expressed fear for her safety, mentioning that her family intended to send her somewhere far from London, somewhere she described only as a quiet parish where no one would recognize her or ask questions about the child she carried. She wrote of her sorrow at being forced to give up her daughter, and of a small locket she intended to sew into the infant's blanket before the separation, a locket that had belonged to her own mother, hoping that one day, if fate allowed, her daughter might find her way back to the truth of her origins. Alina felt tears sting her eyes as the Duke read the letter aloud. It was, in every sense that mattered, confirmation of everything they had begun to suspect. Charlotte Ellery was her mother, and the locket resting against Alina's chest at that very moment was the same one Charlotte had described in her final known letter, a fragile thread connecting a woman erased from history to the daughter she had been forced to abandon. The Duke set the letter down carefully, his expression grave. He explained that while this discovery confirmed Alina's parentage beyond reasonable doubt, it also raised troubling new questions about the Grayson family's continued involvement. If Lord Edmund Grayson's own relatives had been responsible for arranging Charlotte's exile and the concealment of her child decades earlier, his sudden and urgent interest in silencing the Duke's investigation now suggested that the family had far more to hide than simple embarrassment over an old scandal. Something deeper was at stake, something Lord Grayson clearly believed was worth threatening a duke over. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, a servant entered the study to announce an unexpected visitor. Lord Edmund Grayson himself had arrived at the estate, requesting an audience with the Duke on what he described as a matter of considerable urgency. Alina's pulse quickened with alarm, but the Duke, after a moment of consideration, agreed to receive him, insisting that Alina remain present for the conversation rather than retreating to another room. Lord Grayson entered moments later, an imposing man in his 60s with cold, calculating eyes that swept across the room and settled immediately on Alina with obvious displeasure. He addressed the Duke directly, his tone carrying a thin veneer of politeness stretched over unmistakable menace. He stated that he had heard troubling rumors about the Duke's continued inquiries into matters long since settled, and that he had come personally to urge the Duke, as an old family friend, to reconsider stirring up scandals that could only bring pain and embarrassment to everyone involved, including, he added pointedly, the young woman sitting beside him. The Duke, unmoved by the veiled threat, responded calmly that he had no interest in scandal for its own sake, only in uncovering the truth about a woman who had been wronged decades earlier, and a daughter who deserved to know her own history. He asked Lord Grayson directly what exactly had happened to Charlotte Ellery after she was sent away from London, and whether the Grayson family had played any further role in her fate beyond simply arranging her initial exile. Lord Grayson's composure flickered just slightly before he regained control of his expression. He claimed he knew nothing further about Charlotte's fate, that his family's involvement had ended the moment she left London, and that any further speculation was nothing more than baseless gossip unworthy of a man in the Duke's position. But Alina, watching closely, noticed the way his hands tightened slightly around the head of his walking cane, a small, involuntary tell that suggested he was not being entirely honest. She spoke up then, for the first time since Lord Grayson's arrival, asking him directly why, if he truly knew nothing, he had bothered sending a threatening letter warning the Duke to abandon his search. Lord Grayson's eyes narrowed as he turned his attention fully toward her, and for a moment, the polite mask slipped entirely, revealing something colder and more calculating underneath. He told her plainly that she would be wise to accept her fortune quietly and stop asking questions about matters that did not concern her, warning that some truths, once uncovered, brought far more harm than comfort to those who insisted on chasing them. The Duke rose sharply from his chair, his voice carrying a hard edge as he informed Lord Grayson that such statements sounded dangerously close to a threat against a young woman under his protection, and that he would not tolerate any further intimidation, whether directed at himself or at Alina. Lord Grayson, recognizing that he had perhaps revealed more than he intended, quickly retreated into vague reassurances, insisting he meant no harm and had only spoken out of concern for old family reputations. He took his leave shortly after, but not before casting one final, cold glance toward Alina, a look that left her feeling distinctly unsettled long after he had gone. Once Lord Grayson departed, the Duke turned to Alina with a serious expression, admitting that the encounter had only strengthened his suspicion that the Grayson family's secrets ran far deeper than a simple scandal over an unwed pregnancy decades earlier. He believed now that Charlotte's disappearance may not have been as straightforward as records suggested, and that someone within the Grayson family likely knew exactly what had become of her, information they were determined to keep buried at any cost. Alina, despite the fear stirred by Lord Grayson's visit, found her resolve only hardening. She had spent her entire life being dismissed as unimportant, as a nobody unworthy of attention or respect, and she refused to be intimidated into silence now that she was finally close to understanding who she truly was. She told the Duke, with quiet but unmistakable determination, that she intended to see this through to the end, no matter what dangers or secrets stood in the way. Her mother had been silenced once, forced into hiding, and eventually erased entirely from the world that should have protected her. Alina refused to allow the same fate to befall the truth a second time. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his composed exterior, and told her that he intended to stand beside her throughout the investigation, regardless of what threats the Grayson family might attempt. Together, they agreed to expand the search for any surviving records or witnesses who might know what truly happened to Charlotte Ellery after she vanished from London society all those years ago, fully aware that with each step closer to the truth, the danger surrounding them both would only continue to grow. The days that followed brought a flurry of quiet, determined effort. The Duke assigned two of his most trusted investigators exclusively to the search for Charlotte Ellery's fate, while Alina, unwilling to sit idle while others uncovered her own history, insisted on accompanying them whenever possible. They traced Charlotte's path from London to the distant parish mentioned in her final letter, a small village called Hollowmere, nearly a full day's journey from the city, tucked quietly among rolling hills that seemed untouched by the passage of time. In Hollowmere, they found an elderly church registrar who remembered, with some difficulty, a young woman matching Charlotte's description who had stayed briefly at a nearby cottage owned by a distant Grayson relative nearly 27 years earlier. The registrar recalled that the young woman had given birth quietly, with no fanfare or public announcement, and that shortly after she had vanished from the village entirely, her departure arranged hastily and without explanation. He remembered, too, a rumor that had circulated briefly at the time, a whisper that the young woman had not left willingly, that something had happened to force her sudden and permanent absence from Hollowmere. Alina felt a cold dread settle over her as she listened to the old man's fragmented memories. The Duke pressed him gently for more details, and eventually the registrar admitted that he had once overheard a conversation between two Grayson family servants, discussing in hushed tones how the young woman had been sent to a distant estate up north, one owned by a reclusive branch of the Grayson family known for keeping strict privacy around their affairs. He could not recall the exact name of the estate, only that it was somewhere near the coast, isolated and difficult to reach. Armed with this fragment of information, the Duke's investigators began the painstaking process of identifying every Grayson family property along the northern coastline, a search that took several more days and required considerable resources to narrow down. During this time, Alina remained in London, forced to continue managing the increasingly hostile legal challenges brought by Margaret Colt and cousin Harold, who had grown bolder in their attempts to discredit her claim now that rumors of scandal surrounding her birth had begun circulating more widely. Margaret Colt, sensing an opportunity in the growing gossip, hired a barrister who specialized in contesting complicated inheritances, and together they filed a formal legal challenge questioning not only the authenticity of the locket, but the very validity of a will that named an heir through such unconventional and, in their words, suspicious means. The legal battle that followed consumed much of Alina's energy, requiring her to sit through hours of tense meetings with Mr. Barlow and additional lawyers hired to defend her claim, all while the deeper mystery of her mother's fate continued unfolding just beyond her immediate reach. Despite the mounting pressure, Alina refused to let either battle distract her from the other. She attended every legal meeting with the same quiet composure that had carried her through years of humiliation in Ashwell, answering every accusation calmly and honestly, refusing to be baited into the kind of emotional outbursts her opponents clearly hoped would damage her credibility before the court. Slowly, her steady demeanor began to win over some of the very people who had once dismissed her as an obvious fraud, including, notably, the presiding judge overseeing the inheritance dispute, who commented privately to Mr. Barlow that he found Alina's consistency and honesty far more convincing than the increasingly desperate accusations leveled against her. Meanwhile, the Duke's investigators finally identified a remote estate along the northern coast that matched the fragmented description provided by the Hollowmere registrar. The property belonged to a reclusive elderly woman named Agatha Grayson, a distant relation who had lived in near total isolation for decades, rarely receiving visitors and maintaining almost no contact with the rest of her extended family. The investigators discovered, through careful inquiry with local villagers near the estate, that Agatha Grayson had, in fact, taken in a young woman matching Charlotte's description many years earlier, though what became of her after that remained unclear even to those who lived nearby. The Duke immediately arranged for himself and Alina to travel north, determined to speak with Agatha Grayson directly, despite her reputation for refusing visitors of any kind. The journey took nearly 2 full days by carriage, along roads that grew increasingly rough and isolated the further north they traveled, until finally they arrived at a weathered stone estate perched dramatically on a cliff overlooking the churning gray sea below. Gaining entry to the estate proved difficult. A stern housekeeper initially refused them admission, insisting that Agatha Grayson received no visitors under any circumstances, regardless of their standing or purpose. It was only when the Duke mentioned Charlotte Ellery's name directly that the housekeeper's composure cracked slightly, her eyes widening with obvious recognition, before she reluctantly agreed to inform her mistress of their presence. They were kept waiting nearly an hour before finally being led into a dimly lit parlor, where an elderly woman sat wrapped in heavy shawls despite the relatively mild weather outside. Agatha Grayson's face was deeply lined with age, but her eyes remained sharp and alert, studying Alina with an intensity that suggested she recognized something immediately, though she said nothing at first, simply staring for a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice thin but steady, asking Alina directly whether she was Charlotte's daughter. Alina confirmed, her heart pounding, that she believed she was, though she had only recently learned the truth herself and knew almost nothing about what happened to her mother after her birth. Agatha's expression softened slightly, decades of guarded silence finally beginning to crack under the weight of the question she had clearly expected, in some part of her mind, to eventually be asked. She explained that Charlotte had indeed been sent to live with her in this very estate during the final months of her pregnancy, hidden away from London society at the insistence of the wider Grayson family, who feared the scandal her situation would bring upon their name. Agatha admitted, with evident shame, that she had agreed to the arrangement at the time, believing she was simply helping a frightened young woman through a difficult period, without fully understanding the extent of the family's plans regarding the child. After Alina's birth, Agatha continued, Charlotte had been devastated by the arrangement to give up her daughter, fighting desperately against the family's insistence that the child be placed anonymously with a church in a distant town, far enough away that no connection could ever be traced back to the Grayson or Ellery families. Charlotte had insisted on sewing her mother's locket into the infant's blanket herself, a final, desperate act of connection she hoped might one day lead her daughter back to the truth. Alina listened, tears streaming freely down her face now, as Agatha described the heartbreak that had consumed Charlotte in the weeks following the forced separation. But then Agatha's expression grew darker, more troubled, as she continued her account. She explained that shortly after Alina was taken away to Ashwell, Charlotte had grown increasingly desperate, threatening to travel to London herself and expose the entire arrangement publicly, regardless of the consequences to her own reputation or the family's standing. It was a threat that had apparently frightened certain members of the Grayson family enough that drastic measures were taken to ensure her silence. Agatha hesitated for a long moment before finally revealing the darkest part of the story. She explained that Charlotte had disappeared entirely one night, without warning, and that the family had quietly spread word that she had died of a sudden illness shortly after, a story Agatha herself had never fully believed but had been too frightened to question at the time. She suspected, though she could not prove it, that certain relatives, deeply invested in avoiding scandal at any cost, had arranged for Charlotte to be removed permanently from anyone's ability to reach her, sent somewhere far away where she could never again threaten to expose the truth. The Duke's expression hardened with barely controlled fury as he asked Agatha directly whether she believed Charlotte might still be alive somewhere, held against her will, or simply exiled beyond any reasonable hope of return. Agatha admitted she did not know for certain, but she recalled, faintly, a conversation overheard many years ago mentioning a distant relative's property somewhere across the sea, in a colony where difficult family matters were sometimes quietly relocated when scandal needed to be permanently buried far from English soil. Alina felt a fierce, burning hope ignite within her chest despite the horror of everything she had just learned. If there was even the smallest chance that her mother was still alive somewhere, exiled but not gone entirely, she refused to abandon the search now, no matter how far it might lead her or how many powerful enemies stood determined to keep the truth buried forever. News of the visit to Agatha Grayson's estate reached Lord Edmund Grayson faster than either Alina or the Duke anticipated. Within days of their return to London, word arrived that Lord Grayson had grown desperate, aware that his family's carefully guarded secret was now unraveling far more quickly than he could control through polite threats alone. He shifted his strategy entirely, abandoning subtlety in favor of a direct and calculated attack designed to destroy Alina's credibility before she could uncover any further truth about her mother's fate. Margaret Colt, sensing an opportunity to align herself with a more powerful ally in her ongoing legal battle against Alina's inheritance, quietly began meeting with representatives from the Grayson family, and together they devised a scheme intended to discredit Alina entirely. A forged document surfaced within the court proceedings, appearing to be an old letter supposedly written by Charlotte Ellery herself, claiming that she had given her infant daughter to a stranger in exchange for money, framing the entire adoption as a transaction rather than a forced separation, and suggesting that the locket had simply been sold along with the child as a convenient prop rather than a genuine family heirloom. The forged letter caused an immediate uproar when it was presented before the court. Cousin Harold's barrister argued forcefully that this new evidence proved Alina's claim to the inheritance rested on nothing more than a manufactured story, designed to exploit sentimental language in a will written by a man too old and too trusting to properly verify the identity of his chosen heir. Alina sat frozen in the courtroom, watching years of careful investigation threaten to collapse under the weight of a single fraudulent document. Mr. Barlow, however, remained calm despite the sudden crisis, quietly requesting a brief recess to examine the letter more closely. Alina, desperate to prove the document false, immediately sent word to the Duke, who arrived at the courthouse within the hour, bringing with him copies of Charlotte's genuine letters, the ones his investigators had painstakingly gathered during their search. Along with a handwriting expert he had retained specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of attack. When court resumed, the Duke's handwriting expert testified in careful, methodical detail, comparing the forged letter against several verified samples of Charlotte's actual handwriting. He pointed out clear inconsistencies in letter formation, spacing, and pressure that no genuine document from the same author would display, concluding definitively that the letter presented by the opposing counsel was a clumsy forgery, likely created recently by someone with only limited access to a small sample of Charlotte's original handwriting to imitate. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Cousin Harold's barrister attempted to argue that the expert's testimony was merely one opinion among many, but the judge, already inclined toward skepticism after months of increasingly desperate legal maneuvers from Alina's opponents, ordered a formal investigation into the origin of the forged document. Within days, investigators traced the letter back to a clerk who had been secretly paid by an associate of Lord Grayson to gain access to sample handwriting from old Ellery family records, providing the material necessary to attempt the forgery. The exposure of the forgery marked a turning point in Alina's legal battle. The judge, furious at the blatant attempt to manipulate the court, dismissed Cousin Harold and Margaret Colt's challenge entirely, ruling decisively in Alina's favor and ordering that the full inheritance be transferred to her without further delay. But the victory, while significant, did little to address the deeper danger still surrounding Alina and the Duke, as it became increasingly clear that Lord Grayson would stop at nothing to prevent the full truth about Charlotte's fate from ever coming to light. Shortly after the forgery scandal became public knowledge, Lord Grayson made one final, desperate attempt to silence the growing threat to his family's secrets. He arranged a private meeting with the Duke, this time abandoning any pretense of politeness entirely. He arrived at the Duke's estate late one evening, uninvited and clearly agitated, demanding an immediate end to what he called reckless meddling in matters that had been settled decades earlier for the good of everyone involved. The Duke, having anticipated exactly this kind of confrontation, had already arranged for Mr. Barlow, and a court-appointed witness to be present, hidden discreetly within earshot of the conversation. Lord Grayson, unaware of the witnesses listening nearby, grew increasingly reckless as his anger mounted, eventually admitting, in a moment of unguarded fury, that his own father had arranged for Charlotte's permanent removal from England decades earlier, sending her to a distant colonial outpost under a false identity, with strict instructions that she never be allowed contact with anyone from her previous life again. The admission, spoken in a moment of careless rage, provided exactly the confirmation the Duke had been seeking. Lord Grayson, realizing too late the severity of what he had just revealed, attempted to backtrack immediately, claiming his words had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But it was too late. Mr. Barlow and the witness stepped forward from their hidden position, confirming that they had heard every word clearly, and Lord Grayson's face drained of color as he understood the full weight of what he had just exposed about his own family's actions. The Duke informed him plainly that such an admission constituted evidence of serious wrongdoing, potentially amounting to unlawful confinement and fraud spanning decades, and that he intended to pursue full legal consequences unless Lord Grayson cooperated immediately in providing every detail necessary to locate Charlotte Ellery and confirm whether she was still alive. Faced with the collapse of his family's reputation and the very real possibility of criminal prosecution, Lord Grayson finally relented, providing the name and location of the colonial estate where his father had arranged for Charlotte's exile nearly 27 years earlier. Armed with this crucial information, the Duke immediately began arranging passage across the sea, determined to follow the trail to its final destination regardless of the distance or difficulty involved. Alina, though physically and emotionally exhausted from months of legal battles and painful revelations, insisted on joining him for this final stage of the journey. She had come too far, endured too much, to remain behind while the answer to her mother's fate waited somewhere across the ocean. Before their departure, Alina took a moment to reflect on how dramatically her life had transformed in such a short span of time. She had arrived in London as a nobody, a laundress dismissed by an entire town, carrying nothing but a locket and a fragile hope that someone, somewhere, might finally recognize her worth. Now she stood as a confirmed heiress, her fortune secured, her enemies exposed, and on the verge of possibly reuniting with a mother she had never known existed until mere months earlier. Whatever awaited them across the sea, she felt ready to face it, no longer the frightened, invisible woman who had once flinched at every cruel whisper in Ashwell, but someone who had learned, through fire and hardship, exactly how strong she truly was. The voyage across the sea took nearly 3 weeks, and Alina spent much of it standing at the ship's railing, watching the endless gray water stretch toward the horizon, wondering what she would find at the end of such a long and improbable journey. The Duke remained close by throughout the voyage, and in the quiet hours between meals and idle conversation, something had shifted subtly between them, a closeness that neither had fully acknowledged, but both seemed to feel growing steadily with each passing day. He had stood by her through every threat, every legal battle, every painful revelation about her mother's past, and Alina found herself increasingly grateful not just for his assistance, but for his steady, quiet presence itself. When they finally arrived at the small colonial settlement Lord Grayson had named, they found a modest but orderly town built along a wide river, far removed from the grandeur of London society. Following directions provided by local officials, they made their way to a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of the settlement, a home far humbler than anything Alina would have expected for a woman once connected, even distantly, to wealthy English families. An older woman answered the door, her hair streaked heavily with gray, her face weathered by years of unfamiliar sun and hardship. But the moment her eyes settled on Alina, something in her expression shifted entirely. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hand trembling against the frame, staring at Alina as though she were seeing an impossible dream made suddenly real. It was Charlotte, older, changed by decades of exile and hardship, but unmistakably the same woman from the portrait Alina had carried in her heart since that fateful evening in the Duke's study. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply staring at each other across the threshold, 27 years of separation collapsing suddenly into a single, overwhelming instant of recognition. Charlotte finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she asked, almost disbelieving her own words, whether Alina was truly her daughter, the child she had been forced to give up so long ago. Alina, tears streaming freely down her face, confirmed everything, showing her the locket that had traveled with her through every difficult year of her life. The very locket Charlotte herself had sewn into an infant's blanket before being torn away from the daughter she had never stopped loving. The reunion that followed was filled with tears, with painful stories exchanged on both sides, and with a slow, careful rebuilding of a connection that decades of forced separation had never fully managed to sever. Charlotte explained that she had been brought to the colonial settlement under a false name, told that her daughter had died shortly after birth, a cruel lie designed to ensure she would never attempt to search for the truth. She had rebuilt a quiet, modest life for herself in the years since, never remarrying, never fully able to release the grief of losing both the man she loved and the child she had carried, though she had long ago given up any hope of ever learning what truly happened to either of them. When Charlotte learned that the Duke standing quietly nearby was the very same Nathaniel Ashford she had loved so deeply in her youth, the reunion grew even more emotional. The two of them, now older, marked by decades of separate lives lived apart, spoke at length about everything that had happened, about the choices made under family pressure, about regrets carried silently for far too many years. There was no simple resolution to such deep and lasting pain, but there was, at last, honesty, understanding, and a measure of peace that had been denied to both of them for nearly 3 decades. The full truth of the Grayson family's actions was eventually brought before proper legal authorities once the group returned to England, resulting in significant consequences for those responsible for Charlotte's unlawful exile and the decades-long deception surrounding her fate. Lord Grayson, unable to escape the weight of his family's crimes once fully exposed, faced serious legal and social consequences that permanently damaged both his standing and his fortune. Margaret Colt and cousin Harold, having been closely associated with the forgery scandal, found themselves similarly disgraced, their reputations in London society irreparably tarnished by their willingness to align with such corrupt and desperate schemes. Charlotte returned to England alongside Alina and the Duke, choosing finally to reclaim the life and identity that had been stolen from her so many years earlier. She settled into the Ashford estate at the Duke's invitation, given a place of honor and comfort that had been denied to her for far too long, finally able to watch her daughter build a life filled with the respect and security she had always deserved. In the months that followed, as Alina settled fully into her role as one of the wealthiest women in England, the relationship between herself and Duke Nathaniel Ashford deepened steadily beyond simple gratitude or shared purpose. He had stood beside her through every hardship, every threat, every painful truth uncovered along the way, and Alina found herself falling deeply in love with a man who had proven, time and again, that his character was every bit as strong as his title suggested. On a quiet evening at the Ashford estate, beneath the same portrait of Charlotte that had started their entire journey together, Nathaniel took Alina's hand and told her, with complete sincerity, that he had spent his entire life being defined by duty and expectation, but that meeting her had reminded him what it truly meant to choose love without hesitation or regret. He asked her to marry him, not as a duke offering security to an heiress, but as a man who had finally found in her everything he had once believed lost forever. Alina accepted without hesitation, tears of joy replacing the years of pain that had once defined her existence. The woman once dismissed by an entire town as a nobody, mocked for her worn shoes and patched aprons, stood now as a confirmed heiress, a reunited daughter, and soon to be a duchess, having proven through quiet strength and unwavering determination that her worth had never depended on the opinions of those who once refused to see it. Their wedding, held at the Ashford estate months later, brought together an unlikely gathering of people whose lives had been forever changed by the truth Alina had fought so hard to uncover. Charlotte stood proudly among the guests, finally present for a moment of happiness in her daughter's life that she had once believed she would never live to witness. The town of Ashwell, upon hearing news of the wedding, sent no well wishes, no apologies for years of casual cruelty, but Alina found she no longer needed their recognition. She had built something far more meaningful than acceptance from people who had never truly known her at all. As the ceremony concluded, and Alina walked hand in hand with her new husband through the gardens of the estate that was now fully her home, she reflected on the astonishing journey that had brought her to this moment. From an unwanted infant left on a church doorstep, to a laundress mocked and dismissed by an entire town, to an heiress fighting desperately against those who sought to destroy her, and finally to a woman reunited with the mother she never knew and married to a man who had recognized her true worth from the very beginning. The woman everyone once called a nobody had, in the end, become someone entirely unforgettable, not because of the fortune she inherited, but because of the quiet, unyielding strength she had carried within her all along. A year passed quickly after the wedding, and life at the Ashford estate settled into a rhythm neither Alina nor Nathaniel had ever expected to find so naturally comforting. Charlotte remained close to her daughter throughout that first year, slowly rebuilding a bond that decades of separation had interrupted, but never truly destroyed. She spent her mornings walking the gardens with Alina, sharing small memories from her youth, stories about her own mother, and the very locket that had eventually reunited them, filling in gaps of history that Alina had once believed she would never recover. Alina used a portion of her considerable fortune to establish a modest but meaningful fund back in Ashwell, quietly providing support to widows and struggling families in the town that had once dismissed her so cruelly. She did not seek recognition for the gesture, nor did she ever return to the town herself, content instead to know that the kindness she extended reached people who genuinely needed it, regardless of whether they ever learned who had provided it. Mrs. Hartley and the Coltrane sisters, upon hearing rumors of the anonymous fund years later, never once suspected it had come from the very woman they had spent years humiliating, and Alina found a quiet, private satisfaction in that simple irony. The Grayson family's fall from grace continued to unfold over the following months, as further investigations uncovered additional detail about the extent of their decades-long deception. Several other distant relatives came forward, some with their own painful stories of family members quietly exiled or silenced to protect the family's reputation. And the resulting scandal permanently altered the Grayson name from one of respected nobility to one whispered with distrust throughout London society. Lord Edmund Grayson, stripped of much of his influence and wealth through legal proceedings, spent his remaining years in quiet disgrace, a fate Alina felt was justly earned given the suffering his family had caused for so long. Margaret Colt and cousin Harold, having gambled everything on discrediting Alina through fraudulent means, found themselves shunned by the very social circles they had once used their inheritance schemes to protect. Their reputations never fully recovered, and within a few years, both had quietly withdrawn from London society entirely, their names fading into obscurity in much the same way they had once tried to erase Alina's rightful place in the world. Nathaniel, meanwhile, threw himself into managing the combined responsibilities of his dukedom and Alina's substantial inheritance, with the same steady dedication he had shown throughout their entire journey together. He expanded the shipping company Alina had inherited, ensuring fair wages and better conditions for the workers who kept its vessels running across 3 continents, a decision Alina had insisted upon from the very beginning, remembering all too well what it felt like to labor endlessly for people who never considered the well-being of those beneath them. Their partnership, built first on shared purpose and mutual respect, grew steadily into a deep and genuine love that neither had expected to find given the unusual circumstances that first brought them together. Nathaniel often remarked, in quiet moments shared between them, that he considered himself fortunate beyond measure that fate had led Alina into his life, insisting that whatever guilt he carried over his youthful failure to fight for Charlotte had been somehow redeemed through the chance to fight, unwaveringly, for her daughter instead. Charlotte, in the final years of her life, often spoke of the peace she had found in watching Alina flourish, expressing gratitude that despite everything stolen from her, fate had eventually returned to her the one thing she had never stopped hoping for, a chance to know her daughter, to see her happy, secure, and deeply loved. When Charlotte passed away peacefully several years later, surrounded by Alina, Nathaniel, and the family they had built together, she did so with a contentment that had eluded her for nearly 3 decades of exile and uncertainty. Alina never forgot where she came from, even as her life transformed into something far beyond anything she could have imagined during those long, cold years washing linens in Ashwell. She often told her own children, born in the years that followed, that true worth had nothing to do with how the world chose to see a person, and everything to do with the quiet strength carried within, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be recognized. She had been called a nobody for the first 26 years of her life, dismissed, mocked, and overlooked by nearly everyone she encountered. But in the end, it had not been her fortune that defined her, nor even her unexpected connection to nobility. It had been her unwavering refusal to accept the small, cruel judgments of a world that had never bothered to truly see her, and her quiet, persistent belief that the truth, however long buried, would eventually find its way into the light. The woman everyone once called a nobody had become, through resilience and unshakable dignity, someone whose story would be remembered for generations, not because of the title she carried, but because of the strength she had shown in claiming it.